April 6, 1944, 30,000 feet above Berlin. The air was thin, biting cold, and deadly silent. Inside the narrow cockpit of a Messerschmitt Bf 109G, Feldwebel Karl Raymer adjusted the straps on his oxygen mask, his breath fogging the inside of the canopy. His gloved fingers tightened on the control stick as his eyes scanned the distant contrails etched across the pale blue sky. In the distance, high above the capital of the Reich, he could already see them coming. Dozens of glinting dots slowly growing larger. A familiar sight. Another bombing raid. He knew the formation by heart. 4-engine B-17s flying in tight boxes, crawling toward their targets with a sense of inevitability. And somewhere close behind, always the same, the American escort fighters. He allowed himself a small smile. Not long ago, these raids were invitations to easy victories. The bombers were defenseless at the flanks, and the American fighters barely made it halfway across France before turning back to base. Pilots like Raymer had racked up kills with frightening ease. Some even joked that the skies above Germany had become a training ground for Luftwaffe rookies, and now again the same pattern, the same hope, but today would be different. As his squadron formed up, a calm, almost careless voice crackled through his radio headset, their Staffelkapitän issuing instructions. Altitude, heading, expected interception point, routine, mechanical, confident. They had done this 100 times before. There was no fear in their voices, no urgency, just the casual bravado of seasoned hunters preparing for another chase. Their Messerschmitts, though aging, still had teeth, and against what the Germans mockingly called milk bottles with wings, they believed they still held the advantage. The Americans, after all, were amateurs. Overpaid, overfed, and overhear. A flood of young boys in shiny new uniforms with no real understanding of war. They flew as if war was a movie. Raymer tilted his nose downward slightly and looked at the city below. Berlin stretched in every direction like a living machine. Smoke from factories, rail yards pulsing with movement, the dark scars of past bombings still visible on rooftops. Somewhere down there was his sister, working in a munitions plant. He hadn't written to her in weeks. Maybe after this sortie he'd have time. A warning tone in his headset snapped him back to the present. The American formation was now fully visible. And there, just below and behind the bombers, the flickers of movement he had been waiting for. The escorts. His grin widened. P-51 Mustangs. Again. The Germans had watched them arrive in theater with a mix of amusement and dismissal. A new toy, perhaps. Another experiment in American over-engineering. Long nose, bubble canopy, 6 Browning machine guns. Impressive on paper, sure, but untested in the killing airspace above the Reich. They called them Cadillacs of the sky. Pretty, polished, but nothing more than a fresh coat of paint over the same inexperienced hands. Several Luftwaffe aces even called them flying confidence machines. Not because they were powerful, but because only someone truly naive would feel safe flying that far into German airspace. That day, as the first Mustangs broke off to engage the German fighters, Raymer didn't flinch. He welcomed it. His throttle pushed forward. The roar of the Daimler-Benz engine filled his cockpit as the Messerschmitt surged ahead. He was ready for another dance. Another score. Another American dream shot down over Berlin. But just seconds into the engagement, something was off. They weren't retreating. The Mustangs were climbing. Fast. Too fast. They were matching the Messerschmitts turn for turn, and then breaking away with a burst of speed that didn't make sense. One Mustang dove, vanished, then came back up from below, its 6 Brownings unleashing a stream of thunder that tore through a German wingman's fuselage. The fighter disintegrated mid-air. No radio call, no parachute. Karl blinked. Then another flash. A P-51 streaked past his canopy, inverted so close he could see the pilot's goggles. He flinched instinctively. Another roar of guns. Another scream in the radio. Another name gone. He turned hard left trying to get behind one, but it climbed out of reach like it was weightless. He pulled into a spiral, lost control, and had to level out. Already fuel was dropping faster than expected. His hands trembled. This wasn't a milk bottle. This wasn't a toy. And there were more of them. Dozens. Surrounding the bombers like sharks around a fortress. Diving, climbing, covering each other with perfect coordination. Raymer's voice cracked as he called for support. The response was broken. Interference, gunfire, static, then silence. The sky had changed, and as he looked over his shoulder, he saw something that hadn't happened in months. A Mustang was behind him, not chasing, following, calmly, watching, a reminder. They weren't just here to fight, they were here to stay. He dove, ran, survived, barely, landed with a shaking hand and a cracked windscreen. He didn't smile again that day. And the others who came back? They didn't either. If you're still watching this, I want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe air superiority was the turning point in the war? Drop your opinion in the comments and hit that subscribe button if you want to see the war from angles no textbook ever dared to show. The Luftwaffe of 1943 was not just a military force. It was a legend in motion. By that point in the war, it had carved its name into the sky with precision, terror, and pride. German pilots were not seen as mere soldiers. They were regarded as the last noble knights of warfare, dueling among the clouds with speed, instinct, and steel. They had earned that reputation. Aces like Erich Hartmann and Gerhard Barkhorn had already accumulated kill counts that defied belief. Hartmann alone would finish the war with 352 confirmed aerial victories. That number wasn't just staggering, it was terrifying. Most American or British pilots barely survived their first tour. Hartmann made a career out of domination, and he was far from alone. The Luftwaffe had refined the art of air combat long before many American pilots had even set foot in a cockpit. Their doctrines were born from the Spanish Civil War, sharpened during the Blitzkrieg over Europe, and tested in the brutal skies of the Eastern Front. German flight schools were selective, brutal, and thorough. By the time a new recruit was cleared for combat, he had been molded into a weapon. In 1943, the Luftwaffe was still riding high on a wave of battlefield experience and psychological superiority. Even after the turning tides in North Africa and Stalingrad, German fighter groups remained a symbol of elite resistance. Especially in the West, where the Americans had begun their daylight bombing campaigns, many German pilots viewed these raids not as a threat, but as sport. Their arrogance was not baseless. It was built on victories. They flew the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf FW 190, aircraft that had proven their lethality across Europe. The 109, with its slender nose and blistering climb rate, was deadly in the hands of a veteran. The 190, broader and more stable, hit like a hammer in low and mid-altitude dogfights. Against early Allied aircraft, they were often untouchable. The American P-40s and P-39s, too slow. The British Hurricanes, outdated. Even the Spitfire, though elegant, struggled at higher altitudes and longer ranges. This is where the mindset of German pilots began to harden. To them, the sky over Europe was theirs by right, not because of politics, not even because of ideology, but because they believed, deep down, that no one flew like they did, no one trained like they did, no one survived like they did. It was this belief that created the cultural shield around the Luftwaffe, a mix of discipline, tradition, and ego. And when the Americans began introducing new fighters to the field, German pilots reacted with the same scornful smirk they gave to everything new and foreign. The P-51 Mustang? A curiosity at best. Some called it the American Spitfire. Others just laughed. One German ace even compared it to a soapbox racer with a long nose. The consensus was simple. It might look fast. It might have sleek lines and a big engine. But in the hands of green pilots with little to no combat experience, it was just another aluminum coffin waiting to fall from the sky. And in those early days, they weren't entirely wrong. American losses during the initial phases of the strategic bombing campaign were catastrophic. In missions like Schweinfurt and Regensburg, entire bomber groups were shredded by German interceptors. The skies over the Reich turned red with flame and aluminum. Many of those B-17s never made it home. Their escorts, limited by fuel and range, were forced to turn back halfway across France, leaving the bombers exposed in the deadliest stretch of the mission. German pilots nicknamed this the death zone. It became their hunting ground. They waited for the moment the P-47 Thunderbolts and early P-51s had to peel away. Then came the rush. FW 190s screaming in from the sun. Bf 109s diving like hawks. It was efficient. It was brutal. and it fed the belief that nothing the Allies produced could truly match the Luftwaffe's edge. The Germans laughed in the briefings. They joked over radio chatter. They even placed bets on how many kills they would score in a day. This attitude bled into the official doctrine. Luftwaffe leadership, facing logistical shortages and growing pressure from both fronts, still clung to the idea that superior pilot skill could offset overwhelming numbers. They had seen it work before. They believed it would continue to work. But belief is a dangerous thing in war, especially when it blinds you. There were warning signs, subtle changes, slight shifts in the tone of American operations, new tactics, better coordination, unfamiliar silhouettes at higher altitudes. But those signs were drowned out by the weight of past victories. German airfields were still full of confident men in leather jackets and flight scarves. They still walked with the gait of immortals. Young replacements idolized the aces. Medals were pinned. Victories were toasted. The myth of German aerial supremacy was alive, fed daily by tradition and selective memory. But myths have one fatal flaw. They cannot adapt. The Luftwaffe of 1943 was forged in the fires of earlier wars, but it was entering a conflict that had already changed. The Americans were not just learning, they were evolving. And unlike the Luftwaffe, they were being backed by a machine of steel, oil, and numbers that did not care for myths. If you've made it this far, take a second to share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think defines a superior fighting force? Skill, experience, or sheer industrial might? And while you're here, subscribe to the channel for more forgotten stories that cut beneath the surface of history. The early versions of the P-51 Mustang were not designed to win the war. They were designed to fill a gap. Fast, maneuverable, and cheap to build, the original Mustang was never intended to become a legend. In fact, when it first rolled out in 1940, it was built for the British. Not for glory, not for dominance, just as a fast solution to a desperate need. At that time, Britain was standing alone. The Luftwaffe had bombed its cities, battered its airfields, and bloodied its pilots. British production lines were stretched thin. So North American aviation was approached with a simple request. Could they design a fighter in less than 120 days? They said yes. And 117 days later, the Mustang was born. It was light, sleek, armed with 4 machine guns, and at low altitude, it was a beast. But once it climbed beyond 10,000 feet, it struggled to breathe. Its Allison V1710 engine, reliable at sea level, lost power quickly in the thin air of high altitude. That flaw doomed it in the European theater, where most air combat occurred far above the clouds. For a time, the Mustang was sidelined. But war has a way of reawakening lost ideas. In 1942, a British engineer named Ronald Harker flew one of the early Mustangs and saw potential others had missed. He made a simple suggestion: replace the engine, fit it with the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same power plant that made the Spitfire famous. It was a bold idea, and it changed everything. The test results were immediate and astonishing. The new Mustang, fitted with the Merlin 61 engine, could now reach speeds of over 700 kilometers per hour. Its performance in climbs, turns, and dives improved dramatically. And perhaps most importantly, it could now operate effectively above 30,000 feet. The sky, once its limit, had become its playground. But speed and altitude were not enough. To truly change the war, the Mustang needed one more thing: range. That came in the form of 2 metal tanks, drop tanks. Mounted under the wings, these external fuel tanks gave the Mustang a round-trip capability from England to Berlin and back, more than 2,600 kilometers without refueling. It was an engineering compromise that turned the plane from an interceptor into a long-range escort. With those tanks, the P-51 could follow the bombers all the way to their targets, protect them during the bombing run, and then fight off interceptors all the way back to friendly airspace. It was no longer a short-range fighter. It had become the long arm of American air power. The Luftwaffe took notice. At first, they dismissed the sightings. A few Mustangs skimming the edges of formations. Minor threats, easily handled. But then, something changed. The Mustangs stopped turning back. They started staying. And not just at the edges. They began showing up deep inside German territory, above key industrial targets, circling like vultures over cities once thought unreachable by Allied fighters. They would climb to high altitude, well above the bombers. then dive down with terrifying speed to intercept German fighters before they could even get close to the formation. Then just as quickly they would disappear. It felt surgical, coordinated, precise. What many Luftwaffe pilots did not know at the time was that the Americans were now flying with a new set of rules. These Mustangs were not flying solo. They were part of a new escort doctrine that prioritized flexibility and aggressive counterattack over passive defense. This meant that instead of flying directly alongside the bombers in rigid formation, Mustangs could now roam freely, hunt, intercept, and chase German fighters at will. They were given the green light to engage first and protect second. This changed the rhythm of every bombing mission. Before, bomber crews felt exposed the moment the escorts turned for home. That final stretch into the heart of Germany was a gauntlet of flak and fighters. It was the most terrifying part of the mission. But now that fear began to fade. Crewmen started to notice something new. As the flak burst outside their windows and the Messerschmitts approached from above, a silver flash would streak past their wing, and then another. Then the sky lit up with tracers. The Mustangs were there. Sometimes they arrived before the Germans. Sometimes they came down from above. Sometimes they dove in from behind. But they were there. The sound of their engines became a symbol of hope. Some B-17 crews even nicknamed them Angels, not because they were invincible, but because they arrived when death seemed certain. This shift in capability created something far more dangerous than just a fast aircraft. It created a psychological presence. German pilots began to report being shadowed at altitudes where they had once ruled alone. They started encountering Mustangs in places they thought safe: fuel depots, airstrips, supply corridors, even on the edge of their own airfields. A Mustang could appear without warning, strike with precision, and be gone before ground crews could even raise the alarm. They were ghosts in daylight. And unlike the P-47s that came before them, the P-51s did not have to break off early. They stayed for the whole fight. They were still overhead when the mission ended, still patrolling the skies as the last bombers limped home. This endurance made them terrifying. But the most dangerous thing the Mustang introduced was not speed, firepower, or altitude. It was unpredictability. German fighter groups could no longer plan with certainty. They could not time their attacks. They could not rely on patterns. The Mustang had erased the boundaries of the map. Berlin was no longer out of reach. It was now within striking distance, and not just from bombers, from fighters, from hunters, from shadows that roamed where no enemy had ever flown before. If this part of the story caught your attention, let your voice be heard in the comments. Do you think the Mustang's range was more important than its speed or firepower? I'd love to hear your take. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a moment of the war the textbooks forgot. March 1944. Luftwaffe command at Wunstorf Airfield received a series of reports that at first sounded confused. Fighter wings returning from bomber interception missions were describing something strange. They had engaged the usual American formations over northern Germany, but something unexpected had happened. The Mustangs had not turned back. They had not run out of fuel, and they were not behaving like any escort fighter the Germans had faced before. They were still there on the return leg, still fighting, still chasing. Some even followed the German fighters past the target zone. Others attacked while the bombers were still inbound. And in more than one case, Mustangs had been spotted circling Luftwaffe airfields, waiting to strike when the German planes returned home low on ammunition and fuel. At first, Luftwaffe commanders dismissed it as exaggeration, misidentification perhaps, the fog of war. After all, the Americans had never escorted their bombers all the way in and out. Their aircraft simply didn't have the range. For months it had been a predictable dance. American fighters would turn back near the German border. That moment was the curtain rising for the Luftwaffe. It was the death zone, and it belonged to them. But then came the losses, and the silence. Entire squadrons of German fighters were being shredded mid-mission. Interceptions were failing. Kill ratios were collapsing. Reports described P-51s appearing in coordinated teams, diving out of the sun, attacking not just the bombers but the escorts, the attackers, even the reserves. They came from above, from the sides, from behind. There was no safe approach. One mission in particular, a bombing run toward Leipzig, changed the atmosphere entirely. German pilots attempting to engage the bombers were intercepted before they reached the formation. Mustangs were already in position at higher altitudes, blocking their climb. It was a tactic previously reserved for the Luftwaffe. Now it was being used against them. In just 48 hours, one Jagdgeschwader lost over 18 aircraft. Most of them never even saw the bombers. Veteran pilot Oberleutnant Dieter Halberstadt wrote in his diary that night. He said, "We never got close. They came from nowhere. 3 of them dropped through the clouds. I watched Lieutenant Becker go down in flames before I even had time to call out. There were no jokes that night. No laughter in the officers' mess, just silence, and the growing realization that the rules had changed. The Mustang was not just protecting the bombers. It was beginning to hunt. This shift was not accidental. It was the result of a strategic decision made by the U.S. 8th Air Force to change the role of escort fighters. No longer would they simply fly alongside the bombers in tight formation. Now, they were given operational freedom. Commanders realized that the best defense was not reaction, but disruption. By sending their fighters ahead or above the bombers, they could force the Luftwaffe into unfavorable positions. They could break the rhythm of the attack, and so the P-51s were unleashed. Suddenly, Mustangs were patrolling 10 to 15 miles ahead of the bomber stream. Others were stationed thousands of feet higher, using altitude as energy. They attacked in coordinated waves, drawing the German fighters into traps, forcing them to react instead of plan. It worked. The Luftwaffe, so dependent on ambush tactics and well-timed dives, found itself on the defensive. German fighters were now being intercepted before they could form up. Escorts were being overwhelmed. Discipline began to break down. And the Mustang pilots, many of whom were flying their second or third tours, started to sense something dangerous. They weren't the hunted anymore. They were the ones dictating the fight. Stories began to circulate among American bomber crews. Tales of Mustangs diving from 3,000 feet, tearing through enemy formations, then pulling straight up into the sun. Gun camera footage showed Messerschmitts being torn apart mid-air. Smoke, shrapnel, wings folding back like paper. But even more shocking was what happened after. Some Mustangs did not return to the bombers. They followed the German fighters home. This behavior was unheard of. Fighter aircraft pursuing the enemy beyond the engagement zone, tracking them to their landing strips, waiting until their wheels touched the ground before striking. In April, a Luftwaffe base near Braunschweig was attacked by a pair of P-51s just minutes after a squadron had returned from interception duty. The planes were still taxiing when the Mustang strafed the runway. 7 aircraft were destroyed on the ground. 2 mechanics were killed. The message was clear. Nowhere was safe. Pilots began to hesitate. Some returned early. Others avoided direct confrontation altogether. The idea that American fighters would turn back at the edge of German airspace was no longer reliable. One German officer remarked bitterly, "They used to run out of gas. Now they run out of mercy." The psychological toll was devastating. In war, few things are more deadly than unpredictability. Once the Luftwaffe could no longer count on gaps in enemy coverage, their confidence began to unravel. Every flight became a gamble. Every climb felt exposed. The Mustang had not only changed the balance of power in the air, it had shattered the illusion of German control, and it did so with cold precision. Today, we often hear war stories told through numbers. Planes built, pilots lost, bombs dropped. But what often gets lost in the statistics is how war shifts in the minds of those fighting it. The moment the Luftwaffe realized they were being followed home was more than a tactical turning point. It was the death of certainty and the birth of fear. If this moment in the story resonated with you, I want to hear your reaction. Share your thoughts in the comments, and let me know if you've ever come across a shift in history that changed everything without warning. And if you're appreciating the journey so far, take a second to subscribe. Every voice helps bring these forgotten moments back to life. By early 1944, the skies over Europe had become an arena of adaptation. Tactics evolved, formations changed, doctrines were rewritten mid-air, but no shift was more decisive than the arrival of the P-51 Mustang in its final perfected form. Sleek, deadly, and unrelenting, this was no longer a modified aircraft. It was a purpose-built predator. Its 6 .50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing, fired in powerful streams of lead that could shred enemy aircraft in seconds. With 12 .65 rounds of ammunition and a rate of fire that sent over 70 bullets per second into the sky, it had the teeth to match its bite. But the Mustang's real strength was not in the guns. It was in the harmony of its design. Every part of the P-51D had been engineered with a single philosophy in mind: efficiency. Aerodynamically refined, it boasted a laminar flow wing that reduced drag and increased performance at high speeds. Its bubble canopy, introduced in the D model, gave pilots unobstructed 360-degree vision, a crucial advantage in dogfights where situational awareness often meant the difference between life and death. At full throttle, the Mustang could reach speeds of 703 kilometers per hour. It could climb to 30,000 feet in just over 6 minutes. Its service ceiling stretched well above that, allowing it to intercept bombers and fighters at altitudes most German aircraft struggled to reach. And with external drop tanks, it had the range to fly from southern England to the heart of the Reich, engage enemy aircraft and return without refueling. That endurance, paired with the ability to perform aggressive maneuvers in combat, gave the Mustang a tactical edge that many Luftwaffe pilots had never seen before. German fighters like the Bf-109 and Fw-190 were exceptional in their own right. The 109 had speed and climb rate. The 190 had firepower and durability. But both had been designed in the late 1930s and were being pushed to their limits in 1944. Heavier armament, armor, and fuel loads made them less agile, and unlike the Mustang, they were not designed for deep penetration missions or extended aerial endurance. In many engagements, German fighters were forced to take off, climb rapidly, engage, and land again, all within tight operational windows dictated by fuel capacity. The Mustang, on the other hand, was already cruising above the target area, well-rested and waiting. It was a subtle but devastating imbalance. One Luftwaffe pilot described his first encounter with the Mustang as if a hawk had suddenly learned how to hover. He recalled seeing the American fighter diving from above, pulling into a vertical climb, and then turning effortlessly back into the fight. It moved with a kind of calm aggression, as if the plane itself was unbothered by gravity. Even in head-to-head engagements where numbers were equal and tactics standard, the Mustang's design advantages gave it a slight but significant edge. Its ability to retain energy during high-speed turns meant that it could break away from a fight and return moments later with altitude and speed intact. It didn't need to win in one move. It could grind its opponent down, slowly, deliberately. But perhaps the most chilling advantage the Mustang brought to the battlefield was something less tangible. It was presence. When Mustang groups entered German airspace, they were seen before they were heard. High above the contrails, barely visible at first, they loomed, waiting, watching, like shadows cast by an approaching storm. And when they struck, it happened in seconds. Gun camera footage from the era shows the chaos from a pilot's perspective. A Messerschmitt turning to engage suddenly caught in a burst of fire, fragments tearing away from the fuselage, smoke trailing from the engine. Then, a roll, a snap, and silence. The P-51 rarely needed a second pass. Its precision was not luck. It was the result of months of rigorous gunnery training back in the United States, where pilots practiced with moving targets under realistic conditions. By the time they reached Europe, they were not just pilots. They were experts in the science of kill angles, burst duration, and deflection shooting. This professionalism, this surgical approach to air combat, unnerved the Luftwaffe. For years, German pilots had fought with an edge in experience and instinct. Now they were facing an enemy that was just as skilled but backed by an industrial machine that gave them newer planes, fresher parts, and more replacements. Some Luftwaffe officers began to question the sustainability of their tactics. How do you stop an enemy that flies higher, faster, and longer than you can? How do you win a fight where every advantage has shifted and every rule you relied on is now obsolete? One attempt to regain control was the introduction of the Me-262 jet fighter. It was fast, revolutionary, and capable of outpacing the Mustang, but it arrived too late in too few numbers and often lacked experienced pilots. And while the Me-262 could outrun the Mustang, it could not outlast it. In the meantime, the Mustang continued its relentless advance. From Normandy to the Ruhr, from Berlin to Prague, the sound of its engine, that deep, steady growl of the Packard-built Merlin, became the background noise of a war that was no longer leaning in Germany's favor. Even ground troops began to recognize it. Soldiers on both sides would glance up at the roar and, based on its pitch and rhythm, identify whether the aircraft was friendly or hostile. The Mustang's sound was distinctive. a deep mechanical harmony that some GIs nicknamed Roosevelt's piano. For bomber crews, it was the sound of life. For German pilots, it was the sound of a sky that no longer belonged to them. Let me know in the comments how you would have felt facing an enemy that never left, that circled the battlefield from the first minute to the last. And if you believe more people should hear these untold sides of history, tap that subscribe button. This story is far from over. Between April and June of 1944, the skies above Germany underwent a transformation so complete, so brutal, that even the most hardened Luftwaffe veterans began to question the future of their own command. The air war had reached a critical mass, and the P-51 Mustang, no longer the newcomer, was now defining the rhythm of destruction. Day after day, the Allied bombing raids pushed deeper. The targets grew more ambitious. Refineries, factories, rail hubs, and military depots across the heart of the Reich were selected with a kind of cold mathematical precision. These were not random strikes. They were part of a strategy known as the Combined Bomber Offensive, a coordinated effort between the US and British air forces to crush the German war machine from above. But the strategy alone wasn't enough. What made it deadly was what flew with it: the Mustang. By this point, the P-51 was not only escorting bombers, it was leading the air assault. It was sent in first to clear the skies. Then it returned to sweep behind the formation. Then it climbed again to patrol the high altitudes, waiting for any sign of opposition. It flew in layered waves, like an invisible net cast across the entire mission path. German pilots soon realized they were never alone. Some tried to adapt. They changed altitude, flew at odd angles, delayed their climb to intercept. But no matter how clever the approach, the Mustangs always seemed to be there first. On April 29th, a major raid was launched against the German city of Berlin. Nearly 700 bombers filled the sky, flanked by hundreds of P-51s. Luftwaffe command scrambled every available fighter group to intercept. Dozens of Bf-109s and FW-190s screamed into the air from hastily prepared runways. The first contact came not with the bombers but with their guardians. American pilots flying at higher altitudes spotted the German formations early. Using the sun to their advantage, the Mustangs dove in coordinated bursts. Their attacks were sharp, decisive, and continuous. German squadrons were split apart before they could even reach combat altitude. One pilot, Feldwebel Heinrich Vogel, described it later in a post-war interview. He said, "I remember seeing one of our groups, 6 planes in tight formation, just disintegrate. No warning. The Mustangs came from above, fired once, maybe twice, and then vanished into the clouds. We never even saw them coming." What struck many Luftwaffe pilots was not just the violence of the attacks, it was the professionalism. The Americans were not improvising anymore. They were executing. Dogfights still happened, of course, but they were no longer the cinematic duels of earlier years. These engagements were surgical, calculated. The Mustang was not built to dance. It was built to kill. On the ground, German airfields became part of the battlefield. P-51s began targeting runways, hangars, and fuel depots. They attacked as the planes were landing. They strafed convoys delivering ammunition. Even supply trucks moving between rural depots became fair game. The Reich's infrastructure was now under siege from the sky. Air superiority had become so one-sided that Luftwaffe pilots often found themselves outnumbered before they even left the ground. And when they did manage to climb into the air, they were met not by a single squadron of enemies, but by layers of them. Each altitude had its own set of threats. And above them all, at the top of the sky, were the Mustangs. It was a form of aerial dominance that had never existed before in modern warfare. Not just superiority, not just control, total domination. And it was systematic. The goal was not just to win the battle in the air. It was to remove the enemy's ability to fight at all, to grind down the Luftwaffe until there was nothing left to launch. No pilots, no fuel, no parts, no hope. And it worked. German fighter strength began to collapse under the weight of relentless pressure. Replacement pilots arrived with barely 30 hours of flight time. Many were shot down on their first or second mission. Some never even engaged the enemy. They simply vanished into the clouds. The ones who survived carried the burden of watching their friends disappear in front of them. Bomber crews began to notice the shift too. Before, every raid was a game of survival. They knew they were on their own once they crossed into enemy airspace. But now they started to feel the change. They noticed how the Mustangs no longer left their side. They saw how German attacks came later and weaker, sometimes not at all. Veteran crews who had flown during the darkest months of 1943 began to believe they might actually survive their tour. They started decorating their bombers with painted slogans like "Safe with the Mustang" or "Guardian Angels overhead." And it wasn't just symbolic. Statistics from mid-1944 showed that missions with full Mustang escort suffered less than half the losses of earlier raids. The numbers told a story of transformation. In a matter of months, the air over Germany had gone from a place of slaughter to a place of dominance. But not for the Germans. The psychological shift was profound. Young Luftwaffe pilots, many of whom had grown up on the stories of aerial legends, entered combat with the weight of impossible expectations. They were told they were the protectors of the fatherland. They were handed outdated aircraft, rushed through training, and sent into a sky already owned by their enemy. What they found up there was not honor. It was silence, and the cold silver shapes of machines that no longer feared them. The Mustang had become more than a fighter. It was a symbol of industry, of adaptation, of relentless force. It did not roar. It hummed. It did not taunt. It ended. In less than 90 days, the Luftwaffe had gone from predator to prey, and from prey to memory. If this part of the journey gave you a new perspective on how quickly air power can change the course of history, let me know in the comments. And if you believe these forgotten battles deserve to be remembered, take a moment to subscribe. Because every piece of the past we uncover brings us closer to understanding what it cost to win the sky. By the summer of 1944, the cockpit of a German fighter no longer felt like a place of pride. It felt like a coffin with a view. The silence on the radio channels said it all. Once alive with quick jokes, confident chatter, and call-outs from veteran pilots, the frequencies had gone quiet. Young recruits sat in their cockpits waiting for orders, gripping the stick too tightly, breathing too fast, surrounded by a tension no training manual could prepare them for. The Luftwaffe was still flying, yes, but it was no longer hunting. It was surviving. Experienced aces who had once flown hundreds of missions were either dead, grounded, or scattered across different units. The replacements that filled the void were barely trained. Many had only completed emergency flight schools, rushed programs that tried to compress years of combat experience into a few desperate weeks. Some had never even fired their guns in real combat before being thrown into the sky. And the moment they climbed past 10,000 feet, they found themselves alone. The formations that had once moved in tight coordination now fell apart quickly under pressure. Communication failed. Leadership faltered. The P-51s did not give them time to regroup. It was no longer a fight. It was an ambush in slow motion. German pilots learned to fear the horizon, not because they saw anything, but because they didn't. The Mustangs often attacked from high above or out of the sun, invisible until it was too late. A flash, a roar, a burst of tracers, and then silence again. Some survivors reported hearing the gunfire before ever spotting the aircraft. Others described the horror of watching a comrade explode mid-air, only to realize they were next. It was fast, mechanical, ruthless, but what broke their spirit more than anything was the absence of hope. In war, even the most brutal days can be endured if you believe relief is coming. But by August, German pilots knew the opposite was true. Each mission meant fewer friends returning. Each sortie felt closer to suicide. And still the orders came. Scramble, intercept, defend. They flew not because they believed they could win. They flew because there was no alternative. Some Luftwaffe veterans later admitted to circling out of range, avoiding direct confrontation whenever possible. Others claimed to have faked mechanical issues or radio problems to stay grounded, not out of cowardice, but out of exhaustion. They had watched their heroes vanish. Pilots like Walter Nowotny, one of the most lethal aces of the war, were dead. Others, like Galland, were increasingly critical of high command, arguing that leadership had no understanding of what was actually happening in the air. The disconnect between the front lines and the command desks in Berlin had grown deadly, and while the Reich issued propaganda about secret weapons and last-minute victories, the reality at squadron level was grim. Fuel shortages meant fewer training flights. Spare parts were scavenged from wreckage. Maintenance crews worked miracles just to keep engines running. Sometimes a single fighter would be kept flying by cannibalizing 3 others. Meanwhile, the Americans kept coming. And the Mustangs? They never left. German pilots began to recognize individual units. Certain groups of P-51s became infamous. The 352nd Fighter Group, known for their blue-nosed Mustangs, gained a reputation for precision and aggression. Their appearance in the sky above Germany signaled not just a fight, but a slaughter. It was no longer uncommon for Luftwaffe pilots to return from a mission having never fired a single round, because there was nothing left to shoot at, because they were outnumbered, outpaced, outplanned. The silence on the radios wasn't just about jamming or fear, it was mourning in real time. Veteran pilot Günther Bartsch, in a letter recovered after the war, described one mission in just 2 lines. "We climbed. We saw the bombers. Then the silver ones came. I did not hear Hans again." That kind of loss repeated itself across every squadron, every day, across a sky once ruled by those same men. It reached the point where German intelligence could no longer accurately track Allied fighter groups. The Mustangs' range and unpredictability made it impossible to know where or when they would strike. Even at airfields once considered safe, the whistle of diving Mustangs became a death sentence. Some pilots reported nightmares. Others stopped sleeping altogether. And while none of this was recorded in official Luftwaffe reports, historians have found increasing evidence of psychological breakdowns among surviving pilots, a mix of trauma, fatigue, and sheer despair. What had once been an elite fighting force was now being asked to hold back a tidal wave with wooden shields. And it showed. The last pockets of resistance in the air became desperate flares of bravery, not strategy. Lone pilots charging into impossible odds. Inexperienced kids holding the line because no one else was left. Their stories are often untold, but they matter. Because behind every burned-out engine, behind every shattered cockpit glass, there was a name, a voice that once believed in something. And by late 1944, those voices were vanishing, one radio call at a time. If this chapter hit you hard, if it helped you feel the human weight behind the headlines, leave a comment below. These are more than just numbers, and if you believe these stories deserve to live beyond silence, consider subscribing, because remembering is the first step to honoring. The German Luftwaffe had been forged in the fires of a romanticized doctrine, a vision of air superiority rooted in the brilliance of individual pilots, men who flew by instinct, who turned machines into extensions of their will, who became living legends in the eyes of their comrades and their enemies. The entire system had been built around them, around the ace, the hunter, the man with the steady hand and sharp eyes who could outthink and outfly anyone placed in front of him. And for a time, it worked. But war, unlike myth, is not preserved in poetry. It evolves, it adapts, and it punishes those who do not. In 1944, Germany was still clinging to the belief that elite skill could outmatch mass production, that experience would defeat inexperience, that a small, deadly force could stop a storm of metal. America, on the other hand, had embraced a different truth, one that was less romantic and more terrifying in its scale. The war would not be won by heroes. It would be won by industry. By the time the P-51 Mustang reached full production, North American aviation was delivering over 300 units per month. By the end of the war, over 15,000 Mustangs had been built. The vast majority of them were combat-ready, standardized, and fully equipped. And the pilots flying them? They were not chasing glory. They were following procedures. They trained in simulators, drilled in formation flying, practiced emergency landings on steel mat runways. Their missions were pre-planned down to the minute. Radio codes, fuel management, attack vectors, all rehearsed. The Mustang was not a dueling blade. It was a factory-forged weapon, mass-produced to dominate. This level of standardization allowed for something the Luftwaffe could no longer dream of: continuity. When an American pilot was lost, another took his place, one often within days. When a Mustang was shot down, another rolled off the assembly line. When a squadron rotated out, another arrived with fresh aircraft and fresh mines. The system never stopped. Meanwhile, the German production lines were collapsing. Factories in Schweinfurt and Regensburg had been bombed repeatedly. Skilled labor was gone. Fuel was scarce. Even when the Luftwaffe managed to build new fighters, they couldn't train enough pilots fast enough to fly them. They had built their air force around individual brilliance, but the war had become a contest of systems. The German Me-109, once one of the finest fighters in the world, was now outdated. It had limited range, poor cockpit visibility, and required constant maintenance. The Focke-Wulf 190, though powerful, suffered at high altitudes. The Mustang had been designed with altitude endurance and modularity in mind. Its parts were easy to replace. Its engines could be overhauled quickly. Its fuel system supported long-range drop tanks with ease. It even had internal plumbing for pilot relief tubes, a minor but critical detail on 10-hour escort missions. American logistics were not just efficient, they were relentless. Mustang squadrons arrived in England with crates of spare engines, ammunition, tires, and tools. Maintenance crews were rotated and rested. Mechanics had manuals, parts catalogs, and support units behind them. On the other side, German ground crews were working by flashlight in freezing hangars, patching holes with salvaged panels, pouring fuel through cloth filters to remove debris. The imbalance was no longer just in the air. It was on the ground. It was everywhere. And yet, many German pilots still flew with courage, still climbed into their cockpits, knowing the odds. But the truth was clear. The Mustang was not just beating them, it was replacing them. Not one ace, not 10. Thousands of pilots, thousands of machines, all trained to do one thing: protect the mission, clear the sky, return home. Repeat. There was no time for vanity, no space for lone wolves. The Mustang pilot was not a duelist. He was a cog in the most powerful air war machine the world had ever seen. And in that simplicity, in that cold efficiency, lay its most terrifying strength. The Luftwaffe had built its air force around the myth of the master pilot. The Americans had built theirs around the blueprint, and the blueprint was winning. Every Mustang that entered the sky was not just another plane. It was the embodiment of a strategy, a statement of intent, a flying piece of policy. It said, "We will outlast you, we will outbuild you, we will outfly you." And slowly, relentlessly, that message was received. German morale, already fraying, began to disintegrate. Commanders could not explain the losses. Young pilots stopped volunteering. Ground crews looked up at the sound of Mustangs and saw inevitability. One day, it was a blue-nosed Mustang flying over the airfield. The next, it was 3. The next, 12. Then they were not flying over. They were landing on it. The factory had defeated the fighter, and the Mustang had become more than a machine. It had become a prophecy. A sign that no matter how skilled, no matter how brave, no matter how elite you were, you could not outfly the engine of a nation that had turned war into production. If that hit you the way it hit me while writing it, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. What matters most in a fight? Skill or scale? Let me know. And if you want to help keep these stories alive and understood, go ahead and subscribe. Because history, when told right, doesn't just teach, it resonates. By May of 1945, there were no more interceptors rising over Berlin. The skies that had once echoed with the roar of Daimler-Benz engines were now silent. Not from peace, but from exhaustion. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Germany's military machine, no longer existed in any meaningful form. What had begun as the most advanced and feared air force on Earth had been dismantled piece by piece, not just by superior firepower, but by time, pressure, and inevitability. And through it all, one shape remained constant in the sky: the Mustang. It still flew. It flew over fields where panzers had once rolled. It flew over bridges the Reich had tried desperately to hold. It flew over cities now hollowed by war, not because it had to, but because it could, because it had outlived the storm. For the pilots who had once laughed at its silhouette, the Mustang was a joke that turned into a shadow, then into a fear, then into a symbol of something no ace, no squadron, and no amount of training could stop. By the time Germany surrendered, thousands of Mustangs patrolled the ruins of a fallen empire. They no longer had to fight. They simply watched. A reminder that air supremacy was no longer a dream. It was a reality. A quiet, metallic truth written across the stratosphere. In less than 2 years, the Mustang had gone from being dismissed as a toy to becoming the executioner of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. And it had done so not with brutality or spectacle, but with calm efficiency. There are no monuments for the Mustang in Berlin, but its legacy is carved in something deeper: the absence of resistance, the silence of airfields, the surrender of command. It was never about the plane alone. It was about what it represented: adaptation, precision, relentless resolve. The Mustang was the child of desperation, reborn through innovation, and raised in a factory system that treated war not as an art, but as a science. While others believed in the myth of the invincible pilot, America built a machine that made myth irrelevant. It flew higher, it flew longer, and most importantly, it returned, over and over again. In the years that followed, many of the same pilots who had once fought against the Mustang would go on to speak of it with respect. Not admiration born of defeat, but of understanding. Because no matter how much courage you carry into the sky, you cannot outfly a nation that has decided to master the air. That is what the Mustang became. Not a plane, not a weapon, a decision. One that ended the laughter, one that silenced the myth, one that stayed in the sky long after the war was over. Thank you for being here, for listening, for remembering. If this story moved you, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. These aren't just war stories, and they are the echoes of real lives, real losses, and real victories that shape the world we live in. And if you want to keep walking through the forgotten paths of history, the next video is waiting for you on the screen. Click it. Keep going. The past is not done speaking.